My son handed me a handwritten invoice for $800 and said I owed him monthly rent for living in his house. He didn't ask politely. He didn't explain the sudden change. He just slid the paper across my kitchen table like I was a tenant who'd forgotten to pay. I stared at that piece of paper for a long moment, then quietly folded it in half and walked to my bedroom. What he didn't know was that I had been keeping records for 30 years, and when I returned with my own invoice, his face went white. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Henderson, and I was 68 years old when my world shifted beneath my feet like sand giving way to an unexpected tide. For 3 decades, I had lived in the same modest 2-story house on Elm Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa, a town where everyone knew your name, your business, and the exact year you planted the maple tree in your front yard. Mine was 1994, the year my husband Frank and I finally saved enough for the down payment on what we thought would be our forever home. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside. White aluminum siding that had faded to an off-cream color, green shutters that Frank had painted himself but never quite got straight, and a front porch that creaked in 3 different spots depending on how you walked across it. But inside those walls lived 30 years of memories, 30 years of mortgage payments, 30 years of utility bills, property taxes, maintenance, repairs, and the kind of quiet pride that comes from knowing something truly belongs to you. Frank and I had purchased the house when we were both 38 years old. He worked as a shift supervisor at the John Deere plant 40 minutes away, leaving before dawn and returning home with grease under his fingernails and stories about hydraulic systems that I pretended to understand. I worked part-time at the county library, shelving books and helping elderly patrons navigate the new computer catalog system. Together, we made enough to cover the $1,200 monthly mortgage payment, though there were months when we ate more rice and beans than we cared to admit. Those early years were a careful dance of budgeting and sacrifice. We bought a used refrigerator from a neighbor who was moving to Florida. We painted every room ourselves, arguing good-naturedly about whether the living room should be desert sand or warm wheat. Frank won, and 28 years later, those walls were still the color of his choosing. We planted the maple tree in the front yard not because we had extra money for landscaping, but because Frank's sister worked at a nursery and gave us a sapling that was slightly damaged and couldn't be sold. The mortgage payment never felt easy, but it felt purposeful. Each month, I would sit at the kitchen table with the checkbook, carefully writing out the payment to First National Bank of Cedar Falls. Frank would stand behind me, his hand on my shoulder, and we'd both look at the remaining balance printed on the statement. "Getting smaller," he'd say, and I'd nod, adding the receipt to a manila folder I kept in the top drawer of our old oak desk. By the time our son Michael was born in 1995, we had been in the house for just over a year. I can still remember the afternoon we brought him home from the hospital, Frank carrying the car seat while I walked slowly behind, still tender from delivery. The house felt different with a baby in it. Fuller somehow, like it had found its true purpose. We had painted the second bedroom a soft yellow, not knowing whether we were having a boy or a girl, and that room became the center of our universe for the next several years. Michael grew up thinking that house was simply the way homes were supposed to be. He learned to walk by pulling himself up on the coffee table that Frank had built from reclaimed barn wood. He colored on the kitchen walls when he was 3, and I couldn't bear to paint over his artwork for almost 2 years. He carved his initials into the door frame of his bedroom when he was 10, earning himself a lecture about respecting property and a week of extra chores. He never seemed to understand that the house represented anything more than the place where he lived. As Michael got older, I began to realize how little he understood about the sacrifice behind the walls he took for granted. When he was in high school and complained about having to mow the lawn, I tried to explain that taking care of a home was part of owning one. When he left dishes in the sink for days, assuming I would clean them, I tried to teach him that everyone who lived under our roof had responsibilities. But my lessons seemed to bounce off him like rain on a well-waxed car. Frank and I had always been careful with money, but we were generous with Michael in ways that perhaps we shouldn't have been. We paid for his car insurance when he turned 16, reasoning that it was safer for him to have reliable transportation. We covered his cell phone bill through college, telling ourselves it was necessary for emergencies. We never charged him rent when he moved back home after graduation, assuming it would be temporary while he found his footing in the adult world. What I didn't anticipate was how temporary would stretch into permanent, and how permanent would slowly erode the boundaries between parent and child, between homeowner and resident. Michael moved back into his childhood bedroom after college, with 2 duffel bags, and a sense of entitlement that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. He treated the house like a hotel where he happened to know the management personally. The kitchen became his domain in the evenings, leaving behind dirty pans and empty pizza boxes that I would clean up the next morning. The living room television was always tuned to his shows, his gaming console permanently connected, his controllers scattered across the coffee table Frank had so carefully crafted. The garage filled up with his belongings, exercise equipment he never used, boxes of college textbooks he never sold, sporting goods from hobbies he'd abandoned. Frank passed away suddenly when Michael was 25 years old. A heart attack at work. Quick and without warning. One day he was complaining about a difficult employee who couldn't seem to understand the difference between hydraulic fluid and motor oil, and the next day I was sitting in a funeral home selecting a casket and trying to understand how life could change so completely in the span of a phone call. After Frank's death, the house felt enormous and empty, even with Michael still living there. The silence was different. Not peaceful, but hollow. Frank's coffee cup still sat in the dish drainer for weeks, because I couldn't bring myself to put it away. His reading glasses remained on the nightstand beside his side of the bed, waiting for him to reach for them one more time. Michael stepped up in some ways during those first few months of grief. He handled the funeral arrangements when I was too overwhelmed to make decisions. He dealt with Frank's employer about the life insurance and pension benefits. He took over mowing the lawn and shoveling snow, tasks that Frank had always handled. For a brief time, I thought perhaps losing his father would mature him, would help him understand the weight of responsibility that comes with being an adult. But as the months passed, Michael's helpfulness faded back into his old patterns of assumption and entitlement. The house was still mine, legally and financially, but he began to move through it as if he were the one in charge. He rearranged furniture without asking. He invited friends over without checking whether I had other plans. He left for weekend trips without mentioning where he was going or when he'd be back. The mortgage was paid off the year after Frank died. 30 years of monthly payments finally complete. I remember the day I received the letter from the bank, along with the deed that was now mine free and clear. I sat in the kitchen and cried, not from sadness, but from a mixture of relief and grief. Frank would never see this moment, would never share in the satisfaction of owning our home outright. But I also felt a quiet pride in finishing what we had started together, with no more mortgage payments. My financial situation improved significantly. My widow's benefits from Social Security, combined with Frank's modest pension and the small inheritance from my mother, meant I could live comfortably in the house that was now entirely mine. I could afford to maintain it properly, to make the repairs that Frank had always talked about doing when we have a little extra money. But Michael seemed to view my improved circumstances as an opportunity, rather than the result of 30 years of careful planning and sacrifice. He began to make comments about how lucky I was to have such low expenses. He mentioned casually that I probably didn't need as much space as I had. He suggested that I might be happier in a smaller place, somewhere more manageable for a woman my age. At first, I thought he was concerned about my well-being. The house did require maintenance, and there were certainly days when I felt overwhelmed by the endless list of small repairs and seasonal tasks. But gradually, I began to understand that his suggestions weren't motivated by concern for my comfort. They were motivated by his own vision of a future where the house would somehow become his responsibility and his property. The shift was so gradual that I almost didn't notice it happening. Michael began to refer to, quote, our house instead of your house. He started making decisions about household repairs and improvements without consulting me, as if he were the homeowner and I were simply another resident. He invited his girlfriend to move in without asking my permission, presenting it as a done deal rather than a request. When I tried to assert my authority as the homeowner, Michael would respond with a mixture of condescension and frustration. He would remind me that he was helping with maintenance and repairs, as if his occasional efforts to fix a leaky faucet or replace a light bulb were equivalent to 30 years of mortgage payments. He would point out that I was getting older and would need help managing the property, as if my age somehow diminished my legal right to own my own home. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March, when the daffodils Frank had planted along the front walkway were just beginning to push through the last patches of snow. I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking my morning coffee and reading the newspaper, when Michael walked in with a serious expression and a piece of paper in his hand. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask how I had slept. He simply placed the paper on the table in front of me and said, "We need to talk about your rent." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I stared at the handwritten invoice lying on my kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the curtains that Frank and I had hung 15 years ago. The paper was white, lined, torn from a yellow legal pad. At the top, Michael had written monthly housing costs in block letters, underlined twice with a black pen that had pressed deep enough to leave indentations in the paper beneath. The itemized list made my stomach turn. Base rent, $600. Utilities contribution, $150. Property maintenance fee, $50. Total monthly payment, $800. At the bottom, he had signed his name with a flourish and added, "Due by the 1st of each month, beginning April 1st. Michael stood beside the table with his arms crossed, wearing the same confident expression he'd had as a teenager when he'd convinced me to extend his curfew or increase his allowance. But this wasn't a request for pocket money or permission to stay out late. This was a 30-year-old man demanding that his 68-year-old mother pay him rent to live in her own home. "I know this might seem sudden," he said, his tone suggesting he thought he was being reasonable. "But I've been thinking about this for months. You're not getting any younger, Mom, and I'm basically running this place now. It's only fair that you contribute to the household expenses." I folded the invoice in half, then in half again, my fingers moving slowly and deliberately. The sound of the paper creasing was unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. "Running this place?" I asked quietly, not looking up at him. Michael shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Come on, Mom. Who do you think maintains this house? Who fixes things when they break? Who takes care of the yard work? I'm doing all the heavy lifting here." I thought about the $127,000 in mortgage payments Frank and I had made over 30 years. I thought about the new roof we'd put on in 2003 after a hailstorm, the furnace we'd replaced in 2010, the water heater that had failed last spring. I thought about the thousands of dollars in property taxes I'd paid, the insurance premiums, the countless small repairs and improvements that had come out of our savings, then my savings, over 3 decades. "Heavy lifting," I repeated, still not looking at him. "Look, I'm not trying to be unreasonable here," Michael continued, warming to his argument. $800 a month is actually below market rate for this area. You'd pay twice that if you were renting an apartment in town. And this way, you get to stay in a place you're familiar with someone you trust, taking care of everything." The phrase, "someone you trust," made something cold settle in my chest. I set the folded invoice aside and looked up at my son for the first time since he'd placed it in front of me. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt advertising a local brewery, his dark hair uncombed, stubble covering his jaw. He looked like a man who had just woken up in his childhood bedroom and decided to rearrange the world to suit his convenience. "When did you decide this house belonged to you?" I asked. Michael's confident expression flickered. "It's not about ownership, Mom. It's about practicality. You're living here, I'm living here, and I'm doing most of the work to keep the place running. It makes sense for everyone to contribute proportionally." "Proportionally," I said, tasting the word like it was something bitter. "And what exactly is your proportion of ownership in this house, Michael?" "That's not the point." "It is exactly the point." I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "This is my house. I own it. Completely. The deed is in my name, the property taxes come in my name, the insurance is in my name. You live here because I allow you to live here." Michael's face reddened. "Oh, so now I'm some kind of charity case? I've been helping you out for years, Mom. Where's the gratitude?" "Helping me out?" The question came out louder than I intended. By living here rent-free for 5 years? By treating my home like your personal hotel? By leaving your dishes in my sink and your laundry in my washer? I do my share around here, Michael protested. I mowed the lawn last weekend. I fixed the garbage disposal last month. I shoveled the driveway all winter. I walked to the window and looked out at the front yard. At the daffodils that were Frank's idea. At the maple tree that was now 30 years old and tall enough to shade half the front of the house. Michael had mowed the lawn exactly 3 times since the snow melted. The garbage disposal had needed fixing because he'd put something down it that didn't belong there. And he'd shoveled the driveway a total of 4 times all winter, leaving me to clear the snow and ice the other dozen times it was necessary. You think occasional yard work entitles you to charge me rent in my own home, I said to the window. It's not about entitlement, Michael said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. It's about reality. You're not capable of maintaining this place on your own anymore. You need help, and help costs money. I turned back to face him. Not capable? You're almost 70 years old, Mom. You can't climb ladders to clean gutters. You can't move heavy furniture or fix electrical problems. You can barely lift a bag of mulch anymore. Each word felt like a small slap, not because it was entirely untrue. My body had indeed changed over the years, my strength, not what it used to be, but because of the way he wielded my limitations like weapons against my independence. So because I'm older, I should pay you to live in my own house? You should pay your fair share for the services you're receiving, Michael said, crossing his arms again. $800 a month is reasonable for room and board plus property management. Property management. As if my home were a rental unit, and he were some professional landlord, rather than a grown man who'd been living off his mother's generosity for half a decade. I walked past him toward the stairs that led to the second floor. I need to think about this, I said. There's nothing to think about, Michael called after me. The bill is due April 1st. That's next week. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand gripping the banister that Frank had sanded and stained himself when we first moved in. At the top of the stairs, I turned toward my bedroom, then stopped. Instead, I walked to the small den that Frank had used as his office, the room where we'd kept our important papers, and where I'd continued to manage our finances after his death. The oak desk still held Frank's reading glasses, though I'd finally moved his coffee-stained notepad to make room for my own record-keeping. I pulled out the bottom drawer, the one that stuck slightly, and required a firm tug to open. Inside were manila folders, each labeled in my careful handwriting: mortgage payments, property taxes, home improvements, insurance, utilities. I lifted out the mortgage payment folder first. 30 years of documentation. Every monthly statement, every payment confirmation, every year-end summary. The progression from $1,200 monthly payments in 1994 to the final payment in 2020. The gradual decrease in the principal balance, the steady accumulation of equity. The property tax folder was thinner, but no less significant. Annual statements showing the assessed value of the house increasing from $89,000 in 1994 to $167,000 in the most recent assessment. Payments that had started at $1,400 per year and now approached $3,200 annually. Every payment made on time, every year, without fail. Home improvements told its own story. The new windows in 1998, minus $4,800. The kitchen renovation in 2002, minus $12,000. The roof in 2003, minus $8,500. The furnace in 2010, minus $3,200. The water heater last year, minus $1,800. Thousands upon thousands of dollars invested in maintaining and improving the property that Michael now seemed to consider himself entitled to manage. I opened my laptop, an aging Dell that Frank had bought me for Christmas 3 years before he died. It took a few minutes to boot up, making mechanical noises that suggested it was working harder than it should have to. I opened a spreadsheet program and began creating a new document. At the top, I typed Housing Cost Analysis, 1994 to 2024. I started with the mortgage payments, $1,200 per month for 360 months, $432,000 in principal and interest payments over 30 years. Then the property taxes, approximately $2,300 per year on average, totaling $69,000 over 3 decades. Insurance, roughly $800 per year, another $24,000. Utilities, conservatively estimated at $150 per month, $54,000 total. The home improvements were harder to calculate precisely, but I had receipts for most of the major expenses. I estimated conservatively and arrived at $35,000 in improvements and repairs over 30 years. The total was staggering, even to me, $614,000. $614,000 invested in the house that Michael thought he could charge me rent to live in. But that was just the beginning. I created a second section titled Michael's Contributions, 2019 to 2024. 5 years of rent-free living. If he wanted to charge me $800 per month, then his free housing had been worth approximately $48,000. 5 years of utilities included in his free residency, another $9,000. 5 years of property tax relief, $16,000. 5 years of insurance coverage, $4,000. Michael had received $77,000 worth of free housing and services over the past 5 years, and now he wanted to charge me rent. I created a third section, Fair Market Back Rent Calculation. If I were going to charge Michael retroactive rent for his 5 years of free housing, what would that look like? The average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Cedar Falls was currently around $1,100 per month. But Michael hadn't been living in an apartment. He'd been living in a house with a yard, a garage, and all utilities included. A comparable rental would cost at least $1,400 per month. $1,400 per month for 60 months equaled $84,000 in back rent, plus utilities, which I calculated separately at $150 per month for his portion, another $9,000. Michael owed me $93,000 in back rent and utilities, but that didn't account for the improvements I'd made to the property during his residency. The new water heater that provided him with reliable hot water, the upgraded electrical work in his bedroom, the fresh paint in the common areas. If I were a landlord making improvements to a rental property, I would pass those costs along to tenants through increased rent. I worked on the spreadsheet for over an hour, adding formulas and double-checking my calculations. The numbers told a story that was both infuriating and clarifying. Michael had benefited from over $90,000 in free housing and services over the past 5 years, and his response was to demand that I pay him for the privilege of living in my own home. When I was finished, I printed 2 copies of the spreadsheet, one for my records and one for Michael. Then I sat back in Frank's old office chair and thought about the conversation that was about to happen downstairs. Michael was in the living room when I came back down, sprawled across the couch with his laptop open, watching something on Netflix. He looked up when I entered the room, his expression expectant. "So," he said, "have you thought about it?" I placed the printed spreadsheet on the coffee table in front of him. "I have," I said, "and I've prepared my own invoice." He glanced down at the papers, then back up at me with a confused frown. "What is this?" "Your bill," I said calmly, "for 5 years of back rent, utilities, and property improvements. The total comes to $93,000 plus interest." Michael's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally something that might have been fear. He picked up the papers and scanned the numbers, his eyes growing wider with each line. "This is ridiculous," he said finally. "You can't charge me back rent. I've been helping you out." "According to this invoice you gave me," I said, holding up his crumpled demand for rent, "helping out has a monetary value. I'm simply applying your logic retroactively." Michael stood up abruptly, the laptop sliding off his knees onto the couch cushions. "That's completely different. I'm trying to establish a fair arrangement going forward. You're talking about made-up charges for the past." "Made-up charges?" I asked. "Every number on that spreadsheet represents real money. Real mortgage payments, real taxes, real improvements. The only made-up charge in this room is the one where you think you can demand rent from the woman who owns this house." He began pacing back and forth in front of the couch, running his hands through his hair. "Look, maybe I presented this wrong. Maybe we can work something out that's fair for both of us. Both of us? I said. Michael, there is no both of us when it comes to owning this house. I own it. Completely. And if you think you deserve compensation for occasional yard work and fixing the garbage disposal, then by your own logic, I deserve compensation for 30 years of payments, taxes, insurance, and improvements that made it possible for you to have a place to live. Michael stopped pacing and turned to face me. For the first time in years, possibly since he was a child, he looked genuinely uncertain. The confident swagger that had carried him through the morning was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "You're not actually going to make me pay this," he said. It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. I picked up his invoice from the table and held it beside my spreadsheet. "You have until April 1st to decide," I said. "Either we can continue the arrangement we've had for the past 5 years. You live here rent-free in exchange for actually helping maintain the property, or we can implement your new financial system. Your choice." The silence that followed felt heavy and electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. Michael stared at me, as if he were seeing me for the first time, as if the woman who had raised him and housed him and fed him for 30 years had suddenly become a stranger. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "Of course," I replied. "Take all the time you need. But remember, according to your invoice, the new payment schedule starts April 1st. That's in 6 days. The house felt different after our confrontation. Not quieter exactly, but charged with an undercurrent of tension that made even ordinary sounds seem significant. The creak of floorboards overhead when Michael moved around his room, the slam of the refrigerator door when he grabbed something for lunch. The deliberate way he closed his bedroom door each night, just a little harder than necessary. For 3 days, we existed in a strange state of suspended conflict. Michael would come downstairs in the morning, pour his coffee, and nod at me with stiff politeness before disappearing back upstairs to work from his makeshift office. I maintained my normal routines: morning coffee at the kitchen table, afternoon walks around the neighborhood, evening news programs, but I could feel him calculating behind every interaction. On Thursday morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter. Not a formal invoice this time, just a piece of paper torn from a notebook with Michael's handwriting scrawled across it. "Can we talk? I think there's been a misunderstanding." I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. There had been no misunderstanding. Michael had demanded rent from me in my own home, and I had responded by showing him exactly what that arrangement would cost him. The math was simple, even if the emotions behind it were complicated. That evening, he knocked on my bedroom door while I was reading. I called for him to come in, and he entered with the careful posture of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. He'd changed out of his work clothes into khakis and a button-down shirt, as if he were preparing for a business meeting rather than a conversation with his mother. "Mom," he said, settling into the armchair that Frank used to read in. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day." I marked my place in the book and set it aside. "And?" "I think maybe I didn't explain my situation clearly," he said. "I'm not trying to take advantage of you or anything like that. It's just that my expenses have been increasing, and I thought it would be fair for us to split some of the household costs." I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine understanding or remorse. What I saw instead was the same calculated expression he'd worn as a teenager when he was trying to negotiate his way out of trouble. "Your expenses," I repeated. "Well, yeah. Car payments, student loans, credit card bills. Adult responsibilities, you know? And I've been basically subsidizing this household by doing all the maintenance work for free." The word subsidizing hung in the air between us like smoke. Michael truly believed that his occasional efforts to fix a leaky faucet or mow the lawn constituted a financial contribution to the household. He had no concept of the difference between occasional help and actual ownership responsibility. "Michael," I said carefully, "do you understand how much this house has cost over the past 30 years? "I'm sure it was a lot," he said dismissively. "But that was then. We're talking about now, about moving forward with an arrangement that makes sense for both of us." "Both of us," I said again. The phrase had become a particular irritation, the way he used it to imply equal standing in decisions about my property. "Look, Mom, I know the house is legally yours. I'm not disputing that. But practically speaking, I'm the one who takes care of everything now. You can't deny that you need help managing this place." There it was again, the implication that my age had somehow diminished my right to control my own property. The suggestion that needing occasional help with heavy lifting was equivalent to being unable to manage my own affairs. "Help managing it," I said. "Is that what you think you've been doing?" Michael shifted in the chair, his confidence wavering slightly. "What else would you call it?" I stood up and walked to the dresser where I kept Frank's old jewelry box. Inside, beneath his watch and wedding ring, was a small notebook where I had been keeping track of household tasks since our confrontation. I'd started it partly out of curiosity, and partly out of a growing suspicion that Michael's perception of his contributions didn't match reality. "In the past week," I said, opening the notebook, "you've mowed the lawn once for 20 minutes. You fixed a loose handle on the kitchen cabinet, a 5-minute job that involved tightening one screw. You took out the garbage on Tuesday because the can was overflowing and blocking your path to your car." Michael's face reddened. "I do more than that." "Do you?" I flipped to another page. "You've left dirty dishes in the sink every single day. You've used my laundry detergent and fabric softener without replacing them. You've eaten food from my refrigerator without contributing to the grocery bill. You've used my internet, my electricity, my hot water, and my heating without paying a dime toward any of it." "Those are normal household expenses," Michael protested. "Roommates split things like that." "Roommates?" I said, closing the notebook. "Is that what you think we are?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently realizing that any answer would reveal the fundamental flaw in his reasoning. "You're my mother," he said finally, "but we're both adults living in the same house. There should be some equity in the arrangement." Equity. I sat back down on the edge of the bed. "Michael, do you know what equity means in terms of real estate?" He looked confused by the apparent change of subject. "It's like the value of the property minus what you owe on it." "That's right. And what's the equity in this house?" "I don't know. Whatever it's worth, I guess, since you paid off the mortgage." "The house is assessed at $167,000. That's $167,000 in equity that your father and I built over 30 years of payments, taxes, and improvements. That's my equity, Michael, not ours. Mine." Michael was quiet for a moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I understand that, Mom. I'm not trying to claim ownership of the house. I just think that if we're both living here, we should both contribute to the costs." "We should both contribute," I agreed. "The question is what constitutes a fair contribution." I could see the relief in his expression, the assumption that I was finally coming around to his way of thinking. He leaned forward in the chair, ready to negotiate. "Exactly," he said. "So maybe we could work out something smaller than what I originally suggested. Maybe $500 a month instead of $800. "I have a different proposal," I said. Michael nodded eagerly. "I'm listening." "You can continue living here rent-free, just as you have for the past 5 years. In exchange, you will take over all household maintenance responsibilities. Not just the tasks you feel like doing when they're convenient for you, but actual property management." "That sounds reasonable," Michael said quickly. "Let me finish," I said. "That means you'll be responsible for lawn care every week during growing season, not just when the grass gets embarrassingly long. You'll handle all minor repairs promptly, not just when something breaks badly enough to inconvenience you. You'll maintain the gutters, the exterior, the basement, and the garage. You'll manage snow removal, leaf cleanup, and seasonal maintenance." Michael's eager expression was beginning to fade as the scope of actual property management became clear. "You'll also contribute $200 per month toward household expenses, groceries, utilities, and supplies. And you'll be responsible for your own laundry, including providing your own detergent and fabric softener." $200, Michael said. "That seems like a lot on top of all the maintenance work." "It's exactly what your share of utilities and groceries costs," I said. "I've been tracking those expenses too. But if I'm doing all that work around the house, then you'll be contributing something approaching the value of what you receive by living here," I finished. This is my alternative to your rental arrangement. You can accept these terms, or you can pay the $93,000 in back rent you owe according to your own pricing structure and find somewhere else to live." The room was silent except for the sound of the heating system cycling on, sending warm air through the vents that Frank had installed and maintained for decades. Michael stared at his hands, clearly trying to process an outcome he hadn't anticipated. "You're not serious about the back rent thing," he said finally. "I'm completely serious," I replied. "You presented an invoice demanding that I pay you rent to live in my own house. I responded with an invoice for the money you owe me for 5 years of free housing and services. If you want to establish a landlord-tenant relationship, then we need to settle the existing debt first." Michael stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. "This is insane, Mom. I was trying to have a reasonable conversation about splitting expenses, and you're treating me like some kind of deadbeat tenant." "You were trying to charge me rent in my own home," I said calmly. "If that's not the behavior of a deadbeat tenant, I'm not sure what is. I live here too. This is my home too." The words hung in the air between us, loud and raw and revealing. Michael seemed to realize immediately what he'd said, but it was too late to take it back. "Your home," I said quietly. "I didn't mean—" Michael started, then stopped. "I've lived here for most of my life, Mom. Of course it feels like home." "There's a difference between feeling at home and claiming ownership," I said. "And there's a difference between being welcomed as a family member and demanding the rights of a property owner." Michael slumped back into the chair, looking suddenly younger than his 30 years. "I don't understand why you're being so unreasonable about this." "Unreasonable," I repeated. "Michael, you handed me an invoice demanding $800 a month rent to live in a house that I own outright. You told me I should be grateful for the occasional yard work you do in exchange for free housing, utilities, food, and property maintenance. You suggested that my age makes me incapable of managing my own affairs. Which part of my response seems unreasonable to you?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at a point somewhere above my head. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than before. "I guess I don't know what I thought. You thought that because I'm older and because I sometimes need help with heavy lifting, you could rearrange our relationship to your financial advantage," I said. "You thought that because you occasionally help around the house, you're entitled to charge me for the privilege of living in my own home. That's not—" Michael started, then stopped again. "Maybe I didn't think it through completely." "No," I agreed, "you didn't." Michael stood up again, this time more slowly. "So what happens now?" "Now you decide," I said. "You can accept my terms, contribute $200 monthly toward household expenses, and take full responsibility for property maintenance. Or you can pay your back rent and find your own place. Those are your options. And if I don't choose either one?" I looked at him steadily, this man who had once been my baby, my little boy, my pride and joy, and who had somehow grown into someone who could look me in the eye and demand rent in my own home. "Then I'll choose for you," I said. Michael nodded slowly, as if he finally understood that this conversation was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 30 years building equity in more than just real estate. "I need some time to think about this," he said. "Of course," I replied. "You have until April 1st. That's what your original invoice specified." After he left, I sat in the quiet of my bedroom and thought about the conversation. Part of me felt sad about the necessity of drawing such hard lines with my own son, but a larger part of me felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of standing my ground, of refusing to be diminished or taken advantage of insisting on the respect that should have been freely given. Outside my window, the maple tree Frank and I had planted cast long shadows across the front yard in the fading evening light. 30 years of growth, 30 years of seasons, 30 years of roots growing deeper and stronger. Some things I thought were worth fighting for. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor to my doorstep. I was washing dishes after breakfast when the doorbell rang, followed immediately by an authoritative knock. Through the front window I could see a woman in a navy blue coat, holding a clipboard and what appeared to be official documents. "Mrs. Henderson?" she said when I opened the door. "I'm Sarah Martinez from Adult Protective Services. I'd like to speak with you about a concern that's been reported." My stomach dropped. Adult Protective Services. Someone had called APS on me. I invited Ms. Martinez inside, my mind racing through possibilities of who might have made such a call and what they could have claimed. Ms. Martinez was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that suggested she'd had many difficult conversations in living rooms just like mine. She settled into the chair that Michael had occupied the night before and opened a folder. "I want to assure you that this is just a routine follow-up to a report we received," she said gently. "Sometimes these calls turn out to be misunderstandings or family disputes rather than actual cases of elder abuse or neglect." Elder abuse? The words came out sharper than I intended. "The report suggests that you may be experiencing financial exploitation by a family member," Ms. Martinez explained, consulting her notes. "Someone called to express concern that you're being charged excessive rent by an adult child living in your home, and that you may not be capable of managing your financial affairs independently." I stared at her, the pieces falling into place. Michael had called Adult Protective Services on me. My own son had reported me as a vulnerable elder being financially exploited by him, ironically, in an attempt to what? Prove that I was incompetent? Get the state to intervene in our dispute? "Mrs. Henderson," Ms. Martinez prompted gently. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't sure that was entirely true. "May I ask who made this report?" "I can't disclose the identity of the person who called," Ms. Martinez said, "but I can tell you that they claim to be concerned about your well-being and suggested that you might be confused about financial arrangements in your household." Confused. There was that word again, another way of suggesting that my age had compromised my judgment. I thought about the spreadsheet I'd created, the 30 years of meticulously kept financial records, the clear-eyed analysis of Michael's actual contributions to the household versus his demands. "Ms. Martinez," I said carefully, "would you like to see my financial records?" She looked up from her clipboard with interest. "If you're comfortable sharing them, that would be helpful." I excused myself and went upstairs to Frank's old office, returning with the manila folders I'd pulled out earlier in the week. I spread them across the coffee table. Mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance records, utility bills, home improvement receipts. 30 years of documentation that told the story of responsible homeownership. Ms. Martinez examined the files with the attention of someone who knew what to look for. She asked thoughtful questions about the timeline of payments, the current status of the mortgage, and my monthly expenses. I answered each question clearly and thoroughly, providing additional documentation when requested. "These are very comprehensive records," she said finally. "Can you walk me through your current living situation?" I explained everything. Michael's return home 5 years ago, his gradual expansion into more and more of the house, his assumption of authority over household decisions, and finally his demand that I pay him rent. I showed her both invoices, his demand for $800 monthly rent and my calculation of his $93,000 debt for back rent and services. Ms. Martinez studied both documents carefully. "So your son wants you to pay him rent to live in a house that you own outright?" "That's correct." "And you responded by calculating what he would owe you for 5 years of free housing?" "Also correct." Ms. Martinez was quiet for a moment, making notes on her clipboard. "Mrs. Henderson, based on what I'm seeing here, you appear to be completely competent to manage your own financial affairs. Your records are meticulous, your reasoning is sound, and your calculations are accurate." I felt a wave of relief, followed immediately by anger. "Then why was this report made?" "That's a good question," Ms. Martinez said diplomatically. "Sometimes family members disagree about financial arrangements, and occasionally those disagreements result in reports to our office. It's possible that whoever called was genuinely concerned about your well-being, but may have misunderstood the situation. Or," I said, "someone was hoping that a visit from Adult Protective Services would pressure me into accepting an unreasonable financial arrangement." Ms. Martinez didn't confirm my suspicion, but she didn't deny it either. "What I can tell you is that based on my assessment today, you're clearly capable of making your own financial decisions. There's no evidence of exploitation, confusion, or diminished capacity." She closed her folder and stood up. I will be filing a report that indicates no further action is needed. However, if you continue to experience pressure regarding financial arrangements, or if anyone suggests that you're not capable of managing your own affairs, please don't hesitate to contact our office. After Ms. Martinez left, I sat in the living room staring at the business card she'd given me. Michael had actually called Adult Protective Services on me. He'd tried to have the state intervene in our dispute by suggesting that I was a confused elderly woman being taken advantage of financially. The irony was breathtaking. He was the one trying to exploit me financially, and his solution was to report me as a victim of financial exploitation. I heard his car in the driveway around noon. He came through the front door with his usual casual confidence, stopping short when he saw me sitting in the living room with Ms. Martinez's business card in my hand. "What's that?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "A business card from the social worker who visited me this morning," I said calmly. "From Adult Protective Services." Michael's face went through several expressions: surprise, guilt, defiance, and finally a kind of defensive anger. "Oh," he said, "someone called APS to report that I was being financially exploited by a family member," I continued. "They suggested that I might be confused about financial arrangements and incapable of managing my own affairs." "Mom, I can explain." "Can you?" I interrupted. "Can you explain why you thought it was appropriate to call the state and suggest that your own mother is mentally incompetent?" Michael sat down heavily on the couch, his hands clasped between his knees. "I was worried about you. Worried about me. You were talking crazy about charging me $90,000 in back rent. You seemed confused about our living arrangement. I thought maybe you needed someone objective to help sort things out." I studied his face, looking for any sign of genuine concern or remorse. What I saw instead was the same calculating expression I'd been seeing for weeks, the look of someone who was trying to manipulate a situation to his advantage. "So your solution was to have me evaluated for mental competency?" "I thought if a social worker talked to you, they could help you understand that charging family members for past housing isn't reasonable," Michael said. "I thought they could explain that families should work together to share expenses. And you thought they would take your side." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "I thought they would be objective." "They were objective," I said. "Ms. Martinez reviewed all my financial records. She examined both of our invoices. She assessed my mental capacity and my ability to manage my own affairs." "And?" Michael asked, though he looked like he already dreaded the answer. "And she determined that I'm completely competent to make my own financial decisions. She found no evidence of confusion, exploitation, or diminished capacity. She's filing a report recommending no further action." The color drained from Michael's face. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, that you've been living here rent-free for 5 years, that you demanded I pay you $800 a month to live in my own house, and that when I refused and calculated what you actually owe me, you called the state to have me declared mentally incompetent." Michael stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. "That's not what happened. You're making it sound like I was trying to hurt you." "Weren't you?" The question hung in the air between us. Michael stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression shifting from defensive to something that might have been shame. "I was trying to find a solution," he said finally. "A solution to what, exactly?" "To the fact that you're being unreasonable about this whole rent situation. I'm not asking for anything crazy, Mom. I just want us to split household expenses fairly. And when I disagreed with your definition of fair, you tried to have the state declare me mentally incompetent. I didn't." Michael started, then stopped. "I thought maybe you needed help understanding the situation." "The situation," I said, "is that you've been living in my house for free for 5 years. And when you decided you wanted me to pay you rent, I said no. That's not a mental health issue, Michael. That's a property rights issue." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I'd lived for 30 years. Mrs. Patterson across the street was working in her garden, planting what looked like early spring flowers. Mr. Johnson next door was washing his car in the driveway. Normal people doing normal things on a normal Friday afternoon, while inside my house I was dealing with the aftermath of my son's attempt to have me declared incompetent. Ms. Martinez asked me if I felt safe in my own home. I said without turning around. Michael's reflection in the window went very still. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I did, but that was this morning, before I knew that you had called Adult Protective Services on me." Mom, you're safe here. I would never hurt you. I turned back to face him. You tried to have the state intervene in our disagreement by suggesting that I'm mentally incapable of managing my own finances. You attempted to use my age against me to undermine my authority over my own property. How is that not harmful? Michael opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time since this whole situation began, he seemed to understand the gravity of what he'd done. I didn't think about it that way, he said quietly. No, I agreed. You didn't think about it at all. You just assumed that because I'm 68 years old and sometimes need help opening pickle jars, I must be losing my mental faculties when I disagree with you. That's not what I assumed. Then why did you call APS? Michael was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I thought they would make you see reason. Reason, I repeated. Your version of reason. I thought they would explain that what you're asking for isn't normal, that families don't charge each other back rent. And what did they actually explain? Michael looked up at me with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. They explained that you have every right to manage your own property however you see fit. That's right, I said. They explained that this is my house, my decision, and my choice to make. They explained that trying to pressure a property owner into an unfavorable financial arrangement by questioning their mental competency is inappropriate at best. At best? Ms. Martinez also mentioned that attempting to exploit elderly people financially is a crime in Iowa, and that making false reports to Adult Protective Services is also illegal. Michael's face went white. She said that? She said that, I confirmed. She also said that if I continue to experience pressure regarding financial arrangements, or if anyone continues to suggest that I'm not capable of managing my own affairs, I should contact their office immediately. The room was quiet except for the sound of Michael's breathing, which had become shallow and rapid. He looked like a man who had just realized that his clever plan had backfired spectacularly. So where does that leave us? He asked finally. It leaves us exactly where we were before you involved the state in our family business, I said. You have until April 1st to decide whether you want to accept my terms or find somewhere else to live. The only difference is that now I have documentation from Adult Protective Services confirming that I'm competent to make that decision. Michael nodded slowly, as if he were finally beginning to understand the position he'd put himself in. He'd gambled that the state would side with him, would pressure me into accepting his demands, would validate his claim that I was too old and confused to manage my own affairs. Instead, he'd given me official confirmation of my mental competency and created a paper trail documenting his attempt to manipulate the situation. I'm sorry, he said, and for the first time it sounded like he might actually mean it. I'm sure you are, I replied. But sorry doesn't undo the fact that you tried to have me declared mentally incompetent because I wouldn't pay you rent in my own house. Michael nodded again, still looking stunned by the magnitude of his miscalculation. He started toward the stairs, then stopped and turned back. Mom, he said, when you talked to the social worker, did you tell her that you wanted me to leave? I considered the question carefully. I told her that I own this house, and that I have the right to decide who lives in it, and under what conditions. What happens next is up to you. Michael climbed the stairs slowly, like a man carrying a weight he hadn't expected. I listened to his footsteps overhead, heard his bedroom door close with unusual gentleness. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely calm. The state had confirmed what I'd known all along, that I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, my own property, and my own life. Michael's attempt to undermine my authority had instead reinforced it. April 1st was still days away, but I was no longer worried about what decision Michael would make. I was ready for whatever came next. Saturday morning brought another unexpected visitor, but this time it was someone I was genuinely glad to see. My sister Janet knocked on the door at 8:30, holding a travel mug of coffee, and wearing the determined expression she'd perfected during 40 years of teaching high school mathematics. Dorothy, she said without preamble, we need to talk. I invited her in, wondering how much she'd heard about recent events. Janet lived an hour away in Des Moines, but Cedar Falls was a small town where news traveled fast, especially news involving family drama and adult protective services visits. "Linda Patterson called me last night," Janet said, settling into the kitchen chair across from me. Linda was my next-door neighbor, a retired nurse who had a talent for observing everything that happened on our street while appearing to mind her own business. "She said there was a social worker here yesterday asking questions about you and Michael. She's worried about you, Dorothy." Frankly, so am I. I poured Janet a proper cup of coffee and sat down to explain the situation from the beginning. Janet listened without interruption, her expression growing more incredulous with each detail. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and stared at me. "He tried to charge you rent in your own house," she said finally, $800 a month. "And when you refused, he called APS to have you declared incompetent?" "That's right." Janet shook her head slowly. "Dorothy, I've known Michael since he was born, and I love that boy, but what he's doing to you is unconscionable." It was a relief to hear someone else acknowledge the situation clearly, without trying to make excuses for Michael or suggest that I was overreacting. Janet had always been direct, sometimes uncomfortably so, but right now her bluntness was exactly what I needed. "The question is," Janet continued, "what are you going to do about it? I've given him until April 1st to decide whether he wants to accept my terms or find somewhere else to live. And if he refuses both options?" I had been thinking about that question for days. "Then I'll start the legal process to have him removed." Janet nodded approvingly. "Good. You shouldn't have to put up with this kind of manipulation from anyone, especially not from your own son." She paused, studying my face. "But how are you holding up? This can't be easy." It wasn't easy. The stress of the situation had been affecting my sleep, my appetite, my general sense of peace in my own home. But there was something else too. A growing sense of strength and clarity that I hadn't expected. "I'm angry," I admitted. "But I'm also relieved, in a strange way. For months I've been feeling like something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Now I know what it was." "He's been taking advantage of you?" "Yes, but more than that. He's been conditioning me to accept less and less respect in my own home, making me feel like I should be grateful for his presence instead of him being grateful for my generosity." Janet leaned forward, her expression intense. "Dorothy, you need to understand something. What Michael is doing has a name. It's called financial elder abuse, and it's a crime. The fact that he's your son doesn't make it less serious." The social worker mentioned that. "Did she mention that you might want to consult with an attorney? I hadn't thought about involving a lawyer." The situation felt personal, familial, not something that required legal intervention. But Janet's suggestion made me consider the possibility that Michael's behavior might have legal implications beyond our family dynamics. "What would an attorney do?" I asked. "They could explain your rights as a property owner. They could help you understand the legal process for removing an unwanted tenant. Because that's what Michael is, legally speaking. They could also advise you about protecting yourself if Michael escalates his attempts to undermine your authority." The word escalate sent a chill through me. "You think he might do something else?" "Dorothy, he's already tried to charge you rent in your own house and had you evaluated for mental competency. I'm not sure where he goes from here, but I wouldn't assume he's done." Janet stayed for another hour, and we spent the time making practical plans. She gave me the name of an attorney in town who specialized in elder law and property rights. She insisted that I call my doctor and schedule a comprehensive physical and cognitive evaluation. Not because she doubted my competency, but because having recent medical documentation might be helpful if Michael made any future claims about my mental state. Most importantly, she made me promise to call her immediately if Michael did anything else that made me feel unsafe or uncertain about my position. "You're not alone in this," she said as she was leaving. "Frank would be proud of how you're handling this situation, but he'd also want to make sure you have support. That's what family is for, the family that actually acts like family." After Janet left, I called the attorney's office and scheduled an appointment for Monday morning. Then I called my doctor and arranged for a complete physical the following week. Taking these steps felt like putting on armor, not because I expected a battle, but because I wanted to be prepared for whatever came next. Sunday passed quietly. Michael stayed in his room most of the day, emerging only to get food from the kitchen. We didn't speak, but I could feel him thinking, calculating, trying to figure out his next move. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It felt like the pause before a decision. Monday morning, I drove to the law office of Patricia Williamson, attorney at law. Ms. Williamson was about my age, with silver hair and a firm handshake. Her office was lined with law books and certificates, but also with family photos and a small cactus garden on the windowsill. She felt like someone who understood both legal technicalities and human complications. I explained the situation in detail, showing her copies of Michael's rent demand and my response, as well as the documentation from the APS visit. Ms. Williamson reviewed everything carefully, asking clarifying questions and taking notes. "Mrs. Henderson," she said finally, "you're in a very strong legal position. This is your property, you have clear title, and there's no legal basis for anyone to charge you rent to live in your own home. What about Michael's claim that he's been maintaining the property? Occasional maintenance work doesn't create any legal claim to property ownership or management authority. If anything, it could be argued that his maintenance work was payment for the free housing he's been receiving." Ms. Williamson explained that Michael was legally considered a guest in my home, not a tenant, since he'd never paid rent or signed a lease. This meant I had broad authority to set the terms of his residence or to ask him to leave. However, she continued, the fact that he's been living there for 5 years does complicate things slightly. If he refuses to leave voluntarily, you would need to go through a formal eviction process, which could take 30 to 60 days. And the APS call? That's more concerning from a legal standpoint. Making false reports to government agencies can have serious consequences. If he continues to make claims about your mental competency, you might want to consider filing a harassment complaint. Ms. Williamson also suggested that I document everything going forward: dates, times, conversations, any attempts by Michael to undermine my authority or question my competency. She gave me a folder with information about elder abuse, property rights, and the eviction process. "I hope you won't need any of this," she said. "But if you do, you'll be prepared." I left the attorney's office feeling more confident than I had in weeks. Having legal confirmation of my rights and options made the situation feel manageable rather than overwhelming. I wasn't just a mother dealing with a difficult son. I was a property owner dealing with an unauthorized resident who had overstepped his boundaries. When I returned home, I found Michael in the kitchen making lunch. He looked up when I entered, his expression cautious. "Where did you go this morning?" he asked. "I had some errands to run," I said, placing my purse on the counter. "What kind of errands?" I considered how much to tell him. "I met with an attorney to discuss my rights as a property owner." Michael's sandwich making stopped abruptly. "You talked to a lawyer about me?" "I talked to a lawyer about my property and my options for managing it," I corrected. "You came up in the conversation, but you weren't the primary topic." "What did they tell you?" "They told me that I have every right to determine who lives in my house and under what conditions. They also told me that what you've been doing has legal implications that extend beyond family dynamics." Michael set down the knife he'd been using to spread peanut butter and turned to face me fully. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that trying to charge a homeowner rent in their own property could be considered attempted fraud. It means that making false reports to government agencies about someone's mental competency could be considered harassment. It means that your behavior has crossed the line from family disagreement into potentially criminal territory." The color drained from Michael's face. "I wasn't trying to commit fraud. I was trying to establish a fair living arrangement. And I'm trying to maintain my rights as a property owner," I replied. "The difference is that my position is legally sound." Michael leaned against the counter, looking like someone who had just realized that his assumptions about the situation were fundamentally flawed. "So what happens now?" "Now you make your decision," I said. "You have until tomorrow to choose whether you want to accept my terms or find somewhere else to live. After that, I'll make the decision for you. And if you decide I need to leave, then I'll initiate the legal process to have you removed from my property." Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring at his half-made sandwich. When he looked up again, His expression had changed from defiance to something that might have been genuine concern. "Mom," he said slowly, "do you really want me to leave?" It was the first time he'd asked the question directly, without defensiveness or manipulation. For a moment, he sounded like the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when he was scared or hurt. "I want you to respect me," I said. "I want you to acknowledge that this is my home, and that I have the right to manage it as I see fit. I want you to contribute to this household in meaningful ways instead of treating it like a hotel where you happen to know the management. And if I do those things, then we can discuss what a healthy adult relationship between us might look like." Michael nodded slowly. "I need to think about all this." "You have until tomorrow," I reminded him. That afternoon, I called Janet to update her on the attorney meeting. She was pleased that I'd taken legal advice and insisted that I keep her informed about Michael's decision. "Whatever happens," she said, "remember that you're doing the right thing. You've been more than generous with that boy, and if he can't appreciate it, that's his problem, not yours." As evening approached, I found myself feeling strangely calm. The situation was almost over, one way or another. By tomorrow night, I would either have a son who respected my authority and contributed fairly to the household, or I would have my house back to myself. Either outcome felt better than the limbo I'd been living in for weeks. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it while watching the evening news, listening for sounds of movement upstairs. Michael was in his room, presumably thinking about his decision. I wondered what conclusion he would reach, whether he would choose pride or pragmatism, whether he would recognize this as an opportunity for a healthier relationship or see it only as an ultimatum to be resented. Tomorrow was April 1st, and one way or another, everything would change. April 1st arrived with the kind of gray, drizzly weather that made everything feel heavy and uncertain. I woke before dawn, earlier than usual, and lay in bed listening to the rain tap against the windows. Today was the deadline I'd given Michael, and I still had no idea what decision he'd reached. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the morning paper, though I found myself reading the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing any of it. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of old wood settling and the furnace cycling on and off. No footsteps overhead, no signs that Michael was awake yet. At 7:30, I heard his alarm go off, followed by the creak of his bed and the sound of his feet hitting the floor. My stomach tightened with anticipation. Today would bring either resolution or escalation, and I wasn't sure which outcome I was hoping for. Michael appeared in the kitchen at 8 o'clock, fully dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt. He looked like he was preparing for a job interview rather than a conversation with his mother. His hair was carefully combed, his face freshly shaved, and he carried himself with the deliberate posture of someone who had rehearsed what he was about to say. "Good morning, Mom," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Good morning," I replied, setting down my coffee cup. "Have you made your decision?" Michael poured himself coffee, adding cream and sugar with more attention than the task required. I could see him gathering his thoughts, organizing his words. When he finally sat down across from me, his expression was serious but not hostile. "I've been thinking about everything you said," he began. "About respect, about contribution, about what a healthy adult relationship looks like." I waited, letting him find his own way through whatever speech he'd prepared. "I think I've been taking advantage of your generosity," he continued. "Not intentionally, but maybe that doesn't matter. The effect has been the same." It was more self-awareness than I'd expected from him. I felt a small flicker of hope that perhaps this conversation would go differently than I'd anticipated. "Go on," I said. "I accept your terms," Michael said. "The $200 monthly contribution, and taking over all the household maintenance. I think that's fair." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by caution. The words sounded right, but I'd learned not to trust Michael's words without examining the motivations behind them. "What changed your mind?" I asked. Michael was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Honestly? Talking to my friend Jake yesterday. I told him about our situation, and he looked at me like I was crazy." "What did Jake say?" "He said if he tried to charge his mother rent for living in her house, she'd throw him out so fast his head would spin. He asked me what was wrong with me." Michael looked up with something that might have been embarrassment. It made me realize how this looks from the outside. I studied his face, searching for signs of genuine understanding or continued manipulation. And how does it look from the outside? Like I'm a 30-year-old man trying to take advantage of his elderly mother, Michael said quietly. The word elderly stung a little, but I appreciated his honesty. Is that what you think you were doing? I think I convinced myself that I was being practical and fair, when really I was being selfish and entitled. Michael met my eyes directly for the first time in days. I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it. The rent demand, the APS call. All the ways I've been disrespectful. The apology sounded genuine, but I'd been disappointed by Michael's promises before. Words are easy, I said. What matters is whether your behavior changes. I understand that, Michael said. I know I'll have to prove that I mean what I'm saying. How do you plan to do that? Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote up a list of everything I think needs to be done around the house, with a schedule for when I'll do it. I also researched what property management actually involves. He handed me the paper, and I unfolded it to find a surprisingly comprehensive list. Weekly lawn care, monthly gutter cleaning, seasonal maintenance tasks, interior repairs, exterior upkeep. He'd even included things I hadn't thought to mention, like testing smoke detector batteries and checking for drafts around windows and doors. This is thorough, I said, genuinely impressed. I realized I didn't actually know what maintaining a house involved, Michael admitted. I thought it was just fixing things when they broke and mowing the lawn when it got too long. But real property management is about preventing problems, not just reacting to them. I continued reading the list, noting that he'd included estimated timeframes for each task and had organized them by priority and season. Where did you get this information? I spent most of yesterday online, reading about property management and home maintenance. I also called Uncle Dave and asked him what Dad used to do to keep this place running. Dave was Frank's younger brother, a man who'd inherited their father's talent for fixing anything mechanical and their mother's attention to detail. If Michael had talked to Dave, he'd gotten reliable information about what homeownership actually required. What did Uncle Dave tell you? He said Dad spent at least 10 hours a week on house stuff during good weather, and more during winter. He said Dad always said that owning a home was like having a part-time job that never ended. Michael paused. He also said that if I was living here for free, I should be grateful instead of entitled. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like something Dave would say, and exactly like something Frank would have agreed with. Uncle Dave also said that if I didn't start appreciating you properly, he'd come over here and knock some sense into me, Michael added with a rueful grin. Dave always was protective of me, I said. He told me some stories about how hard you and Dad worked to buy this house and keep it running. I guess I never really understood what it cost you both. I folded the maintenance list and set it on the table between us. Michael, I appreciate that you've thought this through more carefully, but I need to know that you understand what changed between us isn't just about household chores and financial contributions. What do you mean? I mean that for months, you've been treating me like a dependent in my own home instead of the homeowner. You've made decisions about my property without consulting me. You've suggested that my age makes me incapable of managing my own affairs. You've acted like you had authority over my life and my home. Michael's face reddened. I know. I can see that now. Can you? Because this isn't just about you doing more chores, Michael. This is about you respecting my autonomy and my authority over my own property and my own life. I understand, Michael said. I do. I've been treating you like you worked for me instead of like I was a guest in your home. Not just a guest, I corrected. Like you were the homeowner and I was some kind of elderly relative you were taking care of. Michael winced. Yeah, that's exactly what I was doing. And that can't happen again. Ever. Regardless of how much maintenance work you do or how much money you contribute, this is my house and my life. I make the decisions. I get it, Mom. Really. I want to be here because you want me here, not because I've manipulated the situation to make it hard for you to ask me to leave. That was a more insightful analysis than I'd expected from him. What made you realize that? Jake asked me a question that I couldn't answer, Michael said. He asked me what I was contributing to your life that was positive. Not just what I was doing around the house, but what I was adding to your happiness, or your sense of security, or your enjoyment of your own home. And what did you tell him? I couldn't think of anything, Michael admitted. I realized that I've been thinking about what you could do for me, not what I could do for you. That's not how family is supposed to work. I felt something shift in my chest, a cautious loosening of the tension I'd been carrying for weeks. This was the kind of insight I'd been hoping Michael would reach, but I still wasn't sure whether it represented genuine change or just more sophisticated manipulation. So what do you think you could contribute to my life that would be positive? I asked. Michael thought for a moment. Company, for one thing. But good company, not just someone taking up space and making messes. Help with things that are actually difficult for you, not just things I feel like doing. Maybe some of the financial stress of homeownership. And in return, I get to live in a beautiful house with someone who loves me, rent-free, while I figure out what I want to do with my life. Michael paused. When I put it that way, it sounds like an incredibly generous arrangement. It is a generous arrangement, I agreed. But generosity requires gratitude, not entitlement. I know that now. I picked up his maintenance list again, scanning the items more carefully. This is a substantial commitment you're making. Are you sure you understand what you're signing up for? I think so. And if I don't, I'll figure it out. Uncle Dave said he'd be happy to teach me anything I don't know. What about the $200 monthly contribution? I've already set up the automatic transfer from my checking account to yours. The first payment will go through on the 15th. Michael had clearly spent considerable time thinking through the practical aspects of our arrangement. But I still had one more concern. What happens if you decide this arrangement isn't working for you? I asked. What if you get tired of the maintenance work, or decide you don't want to pay the monthly contribution? Then I'll tell you honestly, instead of trying to manipulate the situation, Michael said. And if we can't work something out that's fair for both of us, I'll find somewhere else to live. Without drama? Without trying to make me feel guilty or questioning my judgment? Without drama, Michael confirmed. This is your house, Mom. If you want me to leave for any reason, I'll leave. I studied his face one more time, looking for any sign of reservation or resentment. What I saw instead was something I hadn't seen from him in years: respect. All right, I said finally. We can try this arrangement. Michael's relief was visible. Thank you. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm grateful for it. Don't thank me yet, I said. Thank me in 6 months if this is working for both of us. Fair enough. I stood up from the table, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I'm going to run some errands this morning. When I get back, maybe you can show me what you learned about gutter cleaning. Michael grinned. Actually, I was thinking I'd start with the basement. Uncle Dave said Dad always did a spring cleaning down there, checking for water damage and organizing the storage areas. That sounds like a good place to start, I agreed. As I gathered my purse and car keys, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: optimism about living with my son. It might not work out. Michael had disappointed me before, and change was always difficult. But for the first time since this whole situation began, I felt like we might actually be able to build a relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. The rain had stopped while we were talking, and sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. It felt like a good omen, though I was careful not to read too much into the weather. Michael had made the right choice, but the real test would be whether he could sustain it. Time would tell. 6 months later, I stood at my kitchen window watching Michael pressure wash the front walkway. It was early October, and the maple tree Frank and I had planted 30 years ago was dropping golden leaves across the yard that Michael would rake later that afternoon. The scene looked peaceful, domestic, normal. Everything I'd hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first few weeks after our April 1st conversation had been tentative, with both of us stepping carefully around each other like strangers, learning to share space. Michael had thrown himself into the maintenance work with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, as if he could repair our relationship through sheer physical effort. He'd started in the basement as promised, spending an entire weekend cleaning, organizing and waterproofing areas that hadn't been touched since Frank's death. Then he'd move to the garage, creating storage systems and workspaces that made the most of every square foot. By May, he was tackling outdoor projects with Uncle Dave's guidance, repairing loose siding, cleaning gutters, resealing the driveway. The $200 monthly transfer had appeared in my account exactly when promised, and continued like clockwork every month since. But more than the money, it was Michael's attitude that had changed. He asked before making any changes to the house. He consulted me about repair priorities and maintenance schedules. He treated me like the decision-maker I'd always been but had somehow stopped feeling like. The real test had come in July, when the central air conditioning unit failed during a week of 100-degree temperatures. The old Michael would have simply called a repair service and expected me to pay the bill. The new Michael researched options, got multiple estimates, and presented me with a detailed analysis of repair versus replacement costs. The repair would be about $800, he'd explained, but the unit is 15 years old, and the technician thinks we'll just face more problems. A new unit would be $3,000, but it would be more efficient and come with a 10-year warranty. What do you recommend? I'd asked. I think we should replace it. The energy savings alone would pay for the difference over a few years. But it's your decision. I'd chosen replacement, and Michael had coordinated the entire installation process, taking time off work to be present when the technicians arrived. When the bill came, he'd immediately transferred an additional $1,000 to my account without being asked. It's my house, too, he'd said when I questioned the extra contribution. Not legally, but emotionally. I want to take care of it properly. That moment had marked a shift from compliance to genuine partnership. Michael wasn't just following the rules we'd established. He was invested in the outcome in a way that felt healthy and sustainable. The changes weren't limited to household maintenance. Michael had started cooking dinner twice a week, actual meals, rather than reheated takeout. He'd begun joining me for evening news programs, offering commentary and asking questions about local issues. He'd even convinced me to let him teach me how to use some of the smart home features he'd installed with my permission. You don't have to become a tech expert, he'd said patiently as he showed me how to adjust the thermostat from my phone. But these tools can make your life easier if you're comfortable using them. Most importantly, Michael had stopped treating my age as a limitation to be managed and started treating it as experience to be respected. When I mentioned that climbing on stepladders to change light bulbs made me nervous, he didn't suggest that I was becoming incapable. Instead, he bought an extended-reach bulb changer and showed me how to use it safely. This way you can maintain your independence without taking unnecessary risks, he'd said. The difference in language was subtle but significant. Independence rather than dependence. Tools rather than restrictions. Safety rather than limitation. Janet had noticed the change during her monthly visits. He's grown up, she'd observed, after watching Michael explain his plans for winterizing the house. Finally, but the most meaningful validation had come from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson from next door had stopped me during my evening walk in September. Dorothy, she'd said, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but whatever you did to straighten out that boy of yours, it worked. He's been nothing but respectful when he's working in the yard, and I can see how much pride he's taking in maintaining your property. She'd paused, then added, Frank would be proud of both of you. That comment had brought tears to my eyes, because I knew it was true. Frank would have been proud to see Michael taking responsibility, contributing meaningfully, and treating me with the respect I deserved. But he would have been equally proud to see me standing up for myself, setting boundaries, and refusing to accept less than I was worth. The evening of our 6-month anniversary, Michael knocked on my bedroom door while I was reading. He entered carrying a manila folder and wearing the same serious expression he'd had on April 1st. I have something for you, he said, sitting in Frank's old chair. I set aside my book, curious about what had prompted this formal presentation. Michael opened the folder and handed me a single sheet of paper. It was a letter, typed and printed on good stationery, addressed to me and signed by Michael in his careful handwriting. Dear Mom, it began. 6 months ago, you gave me a choice between respecting you and leaving your house. I chose respect, but I'm not sure I fully understood what that meant at the time. Over these past months, I've learned that respect isn't just about following rules or completing tasks. It's about recognizing your wisdom, your strength, and your right to control your own life and property. I continued reading, feeling my throat tighten with emotion. You could have thrown me out when I tried to charge you rent in your own house. You could have had me removed when I called APS to question your competency. Instead, you gave me the chance to become the kind of man Dad would have been proud of. Thank you for seeing potential in me even when I couldn't see it in myself. The letter went on to detail specific things Michael had learned about homeownership, about family relationships, and about the difference between helping and controlling. It ended with a commitment to continue growing and a request to formalize our arrangement with a written agreement that protected both of our interests. I don't ever want there to be confusion about our relationship again, Michael said when I finished reading. I want everything clear and documented so you never have to worry about me overstepping boundaries. I folded the letter carefully and looked at my son. Really looked at him. Perhaps for the first time in years. The man sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the entitled, manipulative person who had demanded rent 6 months ago. This Michael was thoughtful, humble, genuinely concerned about my well-being rather than his own convenience. Thank you, I said simply. For the letter, for the changes you've made, for becoming someone I'm proud to share my home with. Michael's eyes brightened. Does that mean you want me to stay? I want you to stay as long as this arrangement continues to work for both of us, I said. But Michael, I need you to understand something important. What's that? 6 months ago, you asked me if I really wanted you to leave. The answer then was that I wanted you to respect me. Now, the answer is that I want you to stay, but only because you've earned that welcome. Michael nodded seriously. I understand the difference. Do you? Because the minute you start taking my generosity for granted again, the minute you start treating my home like your property, or my kindness like weakness, this arrangement ends. Not because I don't love you, but because I respect myself too much to accept anything less than mutual respect. I understand, Michael said, and I hope I never give you reason to doubt that. We spent the next hour drafting a simple agreement that outlined our mutual expectations and responsibilities. Nothing legally binding, but a clear framework that protected both of our interests and established boundaries that neither of us would cross. That night, as I prepared for bed, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. 6 months ago, I'd felt like a stranger in my own home, diminished and disrespected by someone who should have been my ally. Tonight, I felt like myself again, strong, valued, and in control of my own life. The house felt different now, too. Not just because of Michael's improvements and maintenance, but because of the energy that filled it. Respect instead of resentment. Cooperation instead of manipulation. Genuine affection instead of obligation. Frank's presence seemed stronger in these rooms now, as if his spirit approved of what we'd built here. The home he'd worked so hard to provide was finally being honored the way it deserved. Not just as shelter, but as a foundation for family relationships based on love and mutual respect. Outside my window, the maple tree rustled in the autumn breeze, its roots deep and strong after 30 years of growth. Like the tree, our family had weathered storms and emerged stronger. Like the house, our relationship had been built on a foundation solid enough to last. Some lessons, I reflected, were worth the cost of learning them, and some fights were worth having, even when they required you to risk losing everything to gain what you truly deserved. As I turned off the light, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace in my own home. It had taken standing up to my son to remember who I was, but now I knew. I was Dorothy Henderson. I was 68 years old. This was my house, my life, and my choice. And I had chosen well. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.